For more than a century, textbooks have shown the same timeline. For tens of thousands of years, humans were hunters and gatherers. Then, suddenly, around 10,000 years ago, civilization appeared. Cities, agriculture, architecture, astronomy, writing, almost overnight. And no one asks the most obvious question: what were humans doing for the 10,000 years before that? This gap is not small. It is longer than all of recorded history combined, and it is treated as if nothing happened. Modern humans have existed for at least 200,000 years. They had brains identical to ours. They created art, tools, music, and complex social structures. They crossed oceans, survived ice ages, and adapted to every environment on Earth. And yet, according to the official story, they somehow did nothing meaningful for most of that time. No cities, no science, no large-scale organization, just waiting. That explanation should make us uncomfortable, because intelligence does not work that way. When a species has the same cognitive capacity for tens of thousands of years, development does not pause. It accelerates, collapses, adapts, and re-emerges. Stagnation is not natural, but history insists on it. The reason is simple. The archaeological record appears empty, or at least it appears empty on land. What is rarely mentioned is that during this 10,000-year gap, the planet itself was changing violently. Ice sheets melted. Sea levels rose more than 100 meters. Coastlines moved dozens of kilometers inland. The places humans preferred to live, river mouths, fertile deltas, sheltered coasts, were the first to disappear. If early civilizations existed where humans naturally settled, they are no longer visible. They are underwater. This changes everything. Because the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when most of the evidence is submerged. Over the last few decades, archaeologists have been forced to push the timeline backward. Human footprints in North America dated to over 20,000 years ago. Advanced stone tools found in layers far older than expected. Structures that appear organized, deliberate, and far too complex for their assigned era. Each discovery narrows the gap. But no one talks about the gap itself. No one asks whether what we call the birth of civilization was actually a recovery. A moment when humanity rebuilt after forgetting. Because if civilization existed before the gap, even in forms we no longer recognize, then our entire understanding of progress collapses. It would mean that history is not a straight climb upward. It is a cycle. Connection, expansion, collapse, restart, and we may be living in just the latest iteration. The 10,000-year gap is not empty. It is missing. And the deeper we look, the clearer it becomes that what we call the beginning of civilization may actually be the aftermath of something much older. Something erased not by ignorance, but by time and water. The problem with the 10,000-year gap is not that it is poorly studied. It is that it is poorly framed. Archaeology has long treated this span of time as a slow prelude. A waiting room before civilization. But when we look closely, the data refuses to behave like a prelude. It behaves like an interruption. During this period, the Earth experienced one of the most dramatic environmental transformations in human history. The last ice age ended. Glaciers that had dominated entire continents melted rapidly. In some regions, sea levels rose faster than any human generation could adapt to. Coastlines did not simply move. They vanished. Entire landscapes that had supported human life for thousands of years disappeared beneath the ocean. Forests, river valleys, and fertile plains were erased. Any settlements built there, Even advanced ones would leave no trace on land today. This alone should force us to reconsider what we think is missing, because humans do not avoid coastlines. They depend on them. Food, trade, transportation, communication. If early societies existed, even modest ones, the highest probability is that they were coastal. And coastal archaeology is now underwater archaeology. This is where the gap begins to narrow. As sonar and seabed mapping improved, researchers began finding shapes that defied geological explanation. Linear stone arrangements, platforms, terraces, features too symmetrical to be random. Many are located at depths that match ancient shorelines from the end of the Ice Age. They are not labeled as cities. They are labeled as anomalies, because labeling them otherwise would raise a question no one is ready to answer: who built them? Mainstream history assumes that complex organization requires agriculture. Agriculture requires stability. Stability requires land that does not flood. But this assumption is based on what survived, not on what worked. It ignores the possibility of maritime civilizations, cultures that did not rely on fields but on water, on fishing, trade, and seasonal movement, on navigation instead of walls. Such societies would leave almost nothing behind, and yet their existence would explain something archaeology struggles with: the sudden appearance of agriculture itself. Domestication is not a small leap. It requires experimentation, planning, observation, and long-term knowledge of ecosystems. The idea that humans discovered agriculture independently in multiple regions at roughly the same time is often described as coincidence. But coincidence becomes unlikely when it repeats globally, unless the knowledge already existed. Unless agriculture was rediscovered, not invented. The same is true for architecture, astronomy, and mathematics. These systems appear fully functional at their earliest recorded moments. There is little evidence of trial and error. Instead, we see sudden competence, as if the learning phase happened earlier, as if it occurred during the missing years. This reframes the gap not as a blank space, but as a lost archive. And the archive was not destroyed by invaders or fire. It was drowned. Ancient stories across cultures describe the same event: a great flood, rising waters, lands lost to the sea, survivors starting over. These stories are often treated as metaphor, but geology confirms massive flooding events at the end of the Ice Age. Meltwater pulses that raised sea levels by meters in a single century. Coastlines that disappeared within a human lifetime. For the people living through it, this was not a myth. It was the end of their world. And when worlds end, knowledge fragments. Survivors do not preserve libraries. They preserve what keeps them alive. Navigation becomes dangerous. Trade collapses. Long-distance contact fades. Communities turn inward. What remains are memories, distorted, simplified, encoded into stories. By the time stability returns, the original systems are gone. All that's left is a faint outline. This explains why civilization appears to emerge suddenly around 10,000 years ago. It did not emerge, it reassembled, using fragments of older knowledge that had survived the collapse. The 10,000-year gap is not humanity learning slowly. It is humanity remembering selectively. And the deeper we examine this period, the harder it becomes to maintain the idea that nothing important happened during it. Something happened. Something big enough to erase itself. And that is why it matters now. Because if civilization can disappear once, almost without a trace, then it can happen again. And this time, the gap will not be in our past. It will be in our future. One of the strangest features of early civilization is not how primitive it was. It is how confident it appears. When the first cities emerge in the archaeological record, they do not look like experiments. They look like results. Urban planning appears fully formed. Architecture follows consistent rules. Astronomy is already precise. Agriculture is systematic, not accidental. There is no long, visible period of failure. No centuries of badly planned settlements collapsing before success. No generations of confused trial and error recorded in stone. Instead, we see sudden competence. This should not happen. Any complex system, when invented from nothing, leaves behind mistakes. Flawed designs, inefficient layouts, half-understood techniques. But the earliest known civilizations show the opposite. They behave like cultures that already knew what worked. Take agriculture. Domestication of plants is one of the most complex achievements in human history. It requires understanding seasonal cycles, soil behavior, selective breeding, long-term planning, and delayed reward. A single failed season means starvation. Yet agriculture appears almost simultaneously in multiple regions of the world. Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus, China, Mesoamerica. This simultaneity is usually explained as independent invention, but independent invention of the same complex system at roughly the same time by societies that were supposedly isolated stretches probability. Unless the knowledge was already present. Unless it survived the gap. The same pattern appears in architecture. Early monumental structures are not crude. They are precise. Stone blocks aligned with astronomical events. Foundations engineered to last millennia. Weight distribution that modern engineers still admire. These are not the works of beginners. They are the works of inheritors. Astronomy follows the same pattern. The earliest civilizations tracked solstices, equinoxes, planetary movements, and stellar cycles with astonishing accuracy. Some ancient calendars were so precise that they remain accurate today. This level of observation requires long-term data collection across many generations. But the timelines do not match. There is not enough visible time between primitive societies and advanced astronomical knowledge for this data to have been gathered from scratch, unless it had already been gathered earlier. During the missing 10,000 years, this creates a paradox that archaeology has never fully resolved. Civilization appears suddenly, but behaves as if it is continuing something older. And this paradox grows sharper when we examine what is missing. We do not find early agricultural failures. We do not find early astronomical errors. We do not find early architectural chaos. We find order, which implies memory. But memory of what? The answer may lie in what survived the collapse. When large systems fail, not all knowledge disappears equally. Practical knowledge survives better than abstract knowledge. Skills survive better than records. Techniques survive better than theories. A survivor may not remember why a method works, but they remember that it does. Over generations, explanations are lost, but practices remain. This produces a distinctive signature in the archaeological record. High competence with low explanation. We see this everywhere. Ancient builders used techniques they could not explain mathematically. Sailors navigated oceans without understanding physics. Farmers followed calendars whose origins were forgotten. Knowledge without context. That is the hallmark of inheritance after collapse. Now consider the geographic distribution of early civilizations. They do not appear randomly. They cluster along rivers, deltas, and coastlines, places that would have been ideal for earlier maritime cultures, places that would have survived flooding better than open coasts, places where displaced populations would naturally resettle. This suggests continuity through relocation. When the sea rose, people moved inland. When coastlines vanished, river valleys became refuges. Civilization did not start there. It retreated there. This reframes the entire concept of cradles of civilization. They were not cradles. They were shelters, the survivors of something larger. And what was lost was not only land, but connection. During the Ice Age, sea levels were lower. Continents were connected by land bridges. Coastlines extended far beyond their modern positions. Travel along shores would have been easier, not harder. This was the golden age of human mobility. When the ice melted, the world fragmented. Land bridges submerged. Coastal routes disappeared. Populations were isolated from each other not by distance, but by water. Global networks collapsed into regional ones. And isolation creates the illusion of origin. Each region appears to invent civilization independently, when in reality each is rebuilding from a shared but fragmented past. This also explains why myths of lost lands are global. Atlantis is only the most famous example. Cultures around the world speak of drowned worlds, sunken homelands, ancestors forced to flee rising waters. These stories appear on every continent, not once, repeatedly. They differ in detail, but not in structure. A world existed. The water rose. The world was lost. Survivors rebuilt. This is not metaphor. It is pattern memory. Modern geology confirms rapid sea level rise events at the end of the Ice Age, events capable of destroying entire coastal civilizations within centuries. From a human perspective, that is instantaneous. Imagine losing everything your society depends on within 2 or 3 generations. Trade routes gone, ports submerged, sacred sites erased. You do not preserve knowledge in such conditions. You preserve life. What follows is simplification. Technologies are abandoned. Networks shrink. Specialization disappears. Not because people become less intelligent, but because complexity is expensive. Only when stability returns does complexity grow again. And when it does, it grows on top of whatever fragments survived. This is why early civilizations look advanced but incomplete. They are rebuilding with missing pieces. This is also why we see sudden leaps followed by long plateaus. Civilization does not climb smoothly. It jumps, falls, and jumps again. The 10,000-year gap is not empty because nothing happened. It is empty because what happened did not survive in forms we recognize. The gap represents a collapse so thorough that it erased its own evidence. And yet, it failed to erase everything. It left fingerprints. In architecture, in agriculture, in astronomy, in myth, in genetics. Each fingerprint is faint. Together, they form a hand. And that hand belongs to a past we have not yet named. A past that knew more than we are comfortable admitting. A past that may have ended not in ignorance, but in water. Which brings us to the most unsettling implication of all. If civilization existed before the gap and collapsed, then our current civilization is not unprecedented. It is repeating a cycle. And the conditions that ended the previous one are not gone. They are returning. Sea levels are rising again. Climate systems are destabilizing again. Coastal populations are expanding again. We tell ourselves that technology makes us different. History suggests otherwise. Technology does not prevent collapse. It only changes how fast it happens. The 10,000-year gap is not a mystery of the past. It is a mirror of the future. And the question it asks is not, what did we miss? It is, what will be left of us? One of the most revealing clues that the 10,000-year gap represents a reset rather than a beginning is hidden in how early civilizations understood the world. They did not see themselves as pioneers. They saw themselves as inheritors. The earliest written records we possess do not describe a brave new start. They describe decline, loss, a fall from something greater. Kings do not claim to be inventors of civilization. They claim to be restorers of order. Priests do not say knowledge was discovered. They say it was remembered. Again and again, the same language appears. Before, once, in the time of the ancestors. The Sumerians, often called the first civilization, believed their knowledge was given to them by earlier beings who lived before a great flood. Egyptian texts speak of a time when gods ruled directly on earth, not as a mythic fantasy, but as a historical era that ended. Mesoamerican cultures described previous worlds that were destroyed and rebuilt. These are not stories of beginnings. They are stories of aftermath. Modern interpretation treats these accounts as symbolic, because taking them literally would force us to confront the possibility that organized societies existed before the dates we allow. But symbolism does not explain consistency. Independent cultures, separated by oceans, preserve the same structure of memory. An advanced past, a catastrophe, survivors, and rebuilding. This memory aligns disturbingly well with what geology tells us. At the end of the Ice Age, the planet did not warm gently. It lurched. Meltwater pulses raised sea levels rapidly. In some regions, coastlines retreated kilometers within a human lifetime. What had been familiar geography became alien. Imagine a civilization whose trade routes hug the coast, whose food systems depend on tidal zones, whose sacred sites are aligned with shore-based landmarks. Then imagine those landmarks disappearing. The loss would not be gradual. It would be absolute. Navigation systems collapse when reference points vanish. Trade networks die when ports are gone. Political authority dissolves when communication fails. Civilization does not need invasion to fall. It only needs disconnection. This explains another anomaly in the archaeological record: the abrupt abandonment of sites without signs of conflict. Entire regions appear depopulated with no evidence of war, disease, or famine. People did not die there. They left. Where did they go? Inland, toward rivers, toward higher ground, toward places that could still sustain life. These refuges later become the birthplaces of civilization in our timeline. But they were not birthplaces. They were sanctuaries. This also explains why early civilizations often appear obsessed with water control. Canals, dams, irrigation systems appear immediately, not after centuries of trial, but at the very beginning. A society that invents irrigation from scratch struggles. A society that has survived flooding prioritizes it. Memory of disaster shapes behavior long after the details are forgotten. The architectural choices of early civilizations reflect fear, not experimentation. Fear of water, fear of chaos, fear of losing control again. Even the earliest cities are defensive against nature. Another strange pattern emerges when we examine materials. Stone dominates early monumental architecture, despite being difficult to work. Wood, which is easier, is rarely used for structures meant to last. This choice makes sense only if builders had learned a hard lesson. Wood rots. Stone survives floods. You do not choose stone first unless you have already lost what wood could not protect. This is not the mindset of beginners. It is the mindset of survivors. The same is true for calendars. Early civilizations tracked long astronomical cycles far beyond what immediate agricultural needs required. They measured time on scales that exceeded individual lifetimes. Why? Because long cycles matter when you are watching the environment change. Tracking solstices is useful. Tracking precession is excessive, unless you are monitoring long-term instability. This suggests that early astronomers were not simply curious. They were cautious. They were watching for patterns that had once destroyed their world. All of this points to a civilization memory that predates writing. And memory without writing is fragile. When populations fragment, memory fragments with them. Each group preserves part of the whole. Over generations, those fragments become myths, rituals, and traditions stripped of context. When writing finally emerges, it captures the fragments, not the original system. This creates the illusion that civilization begins at writing. In reality, writing is a late response to loss. It is an attempt to prevent forgetting from happening again. The 10,000-year gap may be the longest forgetting in human history, not because nothing happened, but because what happened was too disruptive to be remembered cleanly. And that raises a final, deeply unsettling possibility. What if our current civilization is repeating the same mistake? We assume continuity because we record everything. We assume redundancy because we store data everywhere. We assume permanence because our structures feel solid, but memory does not survive collapse just because it is digital. If networks fail, access fails. If infrastructure collapses, records become meaningless. If populations fragment, knowledge fragments again. The people who come after us will not inherit our explanations. They will inherit our fragments. And they may look at our remains the same way we look at the first cities, impressed by competence, confused by gaps, unaware of what was lost. They may believe we invented everything we rebuilt, just as we did. The 10,000-year gap is not a flaw in history. It is history behaving as it always has, building, breaking, forgetting, rebuilding. The difference is that now, for the first time, we are beginning to see the pattern while still inside it, and that may be the only chance we ever get to break it. The idea that early civilization began from nothing is one of the most persistent illusions in modern history. It survives not because it is proven, but because it is convenient. A clean beginning is easier to teach than a complicated inheritance. But when the evidence is allowed to speak without being forced into a linear timeline, a very different picture emerges. The earliest civilizations did not behave like innovators discovering the world for the first time. They behaved like people restoring something that had already been lost. Their myths do not celebrate invention. They mourn decline. Their kings do not claim to create order from chaos. They claim to reestablish it. Their oldest stories do not point forward. They point backward. This backward gaze appears everywhere. In Mesopotamia, the first written texts speak of a time before cities, when knowledge came from an earlier age that ended in catastrophe. In Egypt, the earliest dynasties spoke of a distant era when civilization already existed and was later diminished. In Mesoamerica, the idea of multiple worlds destroyed and rebuilt was not poetic symbolism, it was foundational history. Across cultures that never contacted each other in recorded time, the same memory structure survives. An advanced past, a great disruption, survivors, and rebuilding. This consistency is impossible to ignore. Geology now confirms what these stories describe. At the end of the last ice age, the planet did not gradually stabilize. It convulsed. Ice sheets collapsed. Sea levels rose by more than 100 meters. Entire continental shelves vanished. Coastlines that had existed for tens of thousands of years were erased in what, from a human perspective, would have felt like a single lifetime. Human populations did not disappear. They retreated. They moved inland toward rivers and higher ground. They abandoned the sea not because they feared it, but because it no longer behaved predictably. What had once been a road became a threat. Trade collapsed not because people forgot how to sail, but because the world they navigated no longer existed. This is how civilizations actually end, not in fire, not in conquest, but in disconnection. When networks collapse, specialization collapses with them. When specialization collapses, complexity becomes impossible to maintain. Skills survive longer than systems. Practices survive longer than explanations. Knowledge fragments into tradition. This produces a strange archaeological signature. Societies that appear suddenly advanced but unable to explain why their methods work. Builders align monuments to stars without formal astronomy. Farmers follow calendars whose origins are forgotten. Engineers use techniques they cannot mathematically describe. This is not innovation. It is inheritance without context. The so-called first cities are not clumsy experiments. They are carefully planned refuges. Their obsession with water control, flood management, and durable materials reveals a collective memory of environmental trauma. Stone replaces wood not because it is easier, but because it survives what wood does not. Irrigation systems appear immediately because water is remembered as both life and destruction. Nothing about this looks like a beginning. It looks like survival strategy. The 10,000-year gap exists because the evidence we expect to find cannot survive the conditions that ended the previous world. Coastal settlements vanish beneath the sea. Organic materials decay. Ships leave no skeletons. Navigation systems leave no ruins. Oral knowledge collapses when populations fragment. What remains are shadows, and shadows are easy to dismiss. But when those shadows align across architecture, agriculture, astronomy, myth, genetics, and geology, dismissal becomes denial. The most uncomfortable realization is this: the gap is not empty because nothing happened. It is empty because what happened erased its own footprint. A collapse large enough to destroy global networks is also large enough to destroy the evidence of those networks. This makes the gap invisible by design. And it means that what we call the dawn of civilization may actually be the first successful recovery after a forgotten collapse. Human history, then, is not a straight ascent from ignorance to knowledge. It is cyclical. Expansion creates complexity. Complexity creates fragility. Fragility invites collapse. Collapse enforces forgetting, and forgetting makes rediscovery look like invention. We are not special for building cities. We are repeating something we have done before. The unsettling question is not whether there was a civilization before the 10,000-year gap. The unsettling question is why we assume we will be the last. Because the conditions that erase the previous world are not ancient history. They are returning. Rising seas, climate instability, coastal concentration, global interdependence. We are rebuilding along the same fault lines, and if the pattern holds, then future historians will not remember us by our explanations. They will remember us by our fragments. They will see competence without context, structures without stories, technologies without origins. They will argue about how suddenly civilization appeared, and they will be wrong in exactly the same way. The 10,000-year gap is not a mystery of the past. It is a warning written in absence. And the fact that we are only beginning to recognize it now may be the most dangerous part of all. What makes the 10,000-year gap so difficult to confront is not that it lacks evidence, but that it lacks permission. Permission to exist as a real chapter of history rather than an inconvenience. Modern timelines are built like scaffolding. Remove one beam, and the entire structure becomes unstable. The gap is that beam. For decades, archaeology explained the sudden rise of civilization as inevitability. Humans became smarter. Climate stabilized. Agriculture emerged. Cities followed. But this explanation assumes that intelligence evolves suddenly, that capability appears when conditions allow it. Yet modern humans were already fully intelligent tens of thousands of years earlier. Their brains were the same. Their creativity was the same. Their adaptability was proven across every extreme environment on Earth. The missing variable is not intelligence. It is memory. When civilization appears after the gap, it does so with confidence but without explanation. Techniques are applied without recorded theory. Practices exist without documented origins. Societies behave as if they are continuing something whose beginning they no longer remember. This is not how innovation looks. This is how recovery looks. Consider early urban planning. Streets align with cardinal directions. Cities incorporate drainage, zoning, and defensive geography from their inception. These are not solutions discovered slowly. They are solutions remembered imperfectly. The same applies to early law codes. The earliest laws do not read like experimental social contracts. They read like restorations of order after chaos. They emphasize balance, stability, repetition. They are obsessed with preventing collapse. Fear shapes design. Fear of floods. Fear of disorder. Fear of forgetting. The architectural obsession with permanence is especially revealing. Stone replaces organic materials despite the difficulty of quarrying and transporting it. Why choose the hardest option first? Because softness had already failed once. A civilization that begins from nothing chooses convenience. A civilization that survives catastrophe chooses durability. This logic extends to knowledge itself. Early civilizations encode information redundantly. Astronomy is embedded in architecture. Calendars are embedded in ritual. Navigation is embedded in myth. Knowledge is no longer centralized. It is distributed because centralized systems are fragile. This is the behavior of people who have lost everything once before. The 10,000-year gap, then, is not a dark age of ignorance. It is a compression zone. A period where complexity collapses into survivable fragments, where global systems shrink into local traditions, where advanced understanding becomes taboo, symbolic, or sacred. Over time, these fragments are reassembled, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to rebuild. This also explains why early civilizations often appear obsessed with origins. They trace lineages back to divine ancestors, golden ages, or lost homelands. These are not vanity myths. They are attempts to anchor identity in a past that feels larger than the present. A society that truly begins from nothing celebrates progress. A society that rebuilds mourns what was lost. The 10,000-year gap is the longest mourning period in human history, and it left scars. We see them in the uneven distribution of technology. Some regions leap ahead while others stagnate. Some knowledge resurfaces fully formed, while other knowledge never returns. Writing emerges late and spreads unevenly, suggesting not invention but reintroduction. Even language carries the scar. Shared root concepts appear across unrelated cultures, not as borrowed words, but as shared metaphors. Sky, water, time, cycle, return. These are not linguistic coincidences. They are cognitive fossils. They point to a shared past that predates separation. And separation is key. When sea levels rose, humanity fractured. What had once been connected became isolated. Cultural drift accelerated. Memory diverged. The same knowledge survived in different forms, mutated by necessity. When isolation ends, civilizations meet each other and mistake similarity for coincidence. But coincidence does not explain parallel memory. The more we uncover about the gap, the less sense the traditional timeline makes. Civilization does not rise smoothly after it. It limps. It hesitates. It stabilizes slowly, as if testing the world to see if it is safe to grow again. And perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps the real lesson of the gap is caution. A civilization that has collapsed once does not rush to rebuild globally. It stays local. It reinforces boundaries. It mythologizes disaster. It warns future generations through stories rather than instructions. Only when enough time passes, when fear fades into legend, does expansion resume. Columbus did not arrive at a beginning. He arrived at the moment fear had finally worn off. The 10,000-year gap is not an absence in history. It is the space where history learned to be afraid. And that fear shaped everything that came after. If the 10,000-year gap represents a collapse, then geography itself becomes a missing witness. Modern maps quietly lie to us. They show continents as if they have always looked this way, coastlines as if they were fixed, seas as if they were eternal boundaries. But during the missing millennia, the world was shaped very differently. Vast areas of land that once connected people, cultures, and ecosystems no longer exist above water. During the last ice age, sea levels were so low that entire continental shelves were exposed. What are now shallow seas were once wide coastal plains. What are now isolated islands were once mountain ranges overlooking fertile valleys. Travel along these coastlines would have been continuous, efficient, and familiar. Human settlement patterns follow resources, not myths, and the richest resources were always found near water. This means the densest populations of the ancient world were not inland. They were coastal. When the ice melted, those populations were erased from the map. Not killed, erased. Their homes drowned, their ports vanished, their landmarks disappeared. Their trade routes collapsed as the sea swallowed the very roads they depended on. From the perspective of future archaeologists, it would look like those people never existed. This is why the archaeological record suddenly thins out exactly where it should be richest. This is why we find scattered inland sites but almost nothing older than the gap near modern coastlines. This is why civilization seems to appear only after sea levels stabilize. We are looking in the wrong place. The world before the gap was not built for permanence. It was built for access, and access disappeared. This also explains why early post-gap civilizations appear geographically conservative. They cluster near rivers, avoid open coasts, and build away from flood-prone zones. The sea is no longer a highway. It is a memory of loss. Even mythology reflects this shift. Oceans transform from roads into monsters. Floods become divine punishment. Water becomes something to fear, not navigate. Fear rewrites culture. Navigation knowledge that once connected continents becomes taboo, symbolic, or sacred. Routes turn into legends. Lands beyond the horizon turn into forbidden realms. The past is not forgotten all at once. It is distorted. Maps are among the last things to survive distortion. Ancient maps often depict coastlines that do not match the modern world. Scholars call them inaccurate, but accuracy depends on reference. A map that looks wrong today may have been perfectly accurate for a world that no longer exists. This possibility is rarely entertained. Instead, anomalies are explained away as artistic error or imagination. But the repetition is the problem. The same errors appear across independent cultures. Coastlines extended further. Islands drawn where the sea now lies empty. Land bridges hinted at long after they vanished. These maps are not predicting the future. They are remembering the past. And memory, when stripped of context, looks like fantasy. The same is true for ancient descriptions of journeys that no longer make sense. Voyages that seem impossibly long. Destinations that cannot be found. Travel times that do not match modern geography, because modern geography is incomplete. We live on the aftermath of a flood. When the world changed, survivors adapted by shrinking their understanding of it. They focused on what remained. Over generations, what was lost stopped being practical knowledge and became myth. But myth preserves structure even when detail fades. This is why stories of lost lands, sunken homelands, and drowned ancestors are global. They are not cultural coincidences. They are fragmented memories of the same event viewed from different shores. The 10,000-year gap is not just a temporal mystery, it is a spatial one. Our maps of the ancient world are missing continents that no longer exist, not in the sense of Atlantis as fantasy, but in the sense of drowned landscapes that once supported human life and connection. The tragedy is that these places are not unreachable. They are simply ignored. Modern technology can map the ocean floor in extraordinary detail, but funding, attention, and academic permission are selective. Shipwrecks are glamorous. Lost civilizations are inconvenient. A sunken port threatens the timeline. A drowned city threatens careers, so the focus remains narrow. Yet every year, more data accumulates. Linear features, right angles, terraces, stone arrangements far below modern sea level. Features that defy geological explanation but align perfectly with ancient shorelines. They are not labeled as evidence of civilization. They are labeled as anomalies. Because anomalies can be filed away. Acknowledgement cannot. The 10,000-year gap persists because it is easier to believe in human stagnation than in human loss. Easier to imagine ignorance than erasure. Easier to teach beginnings than to explain resets. But history does not reset gently. It fractures, and fractures leave scars. We are standing on the highest ground of a flooded world, telling ourselves that nothing existed below. The gap is not empty, it is submerged. And until we are willing to look where the water rose, we will keep mistaking the ruins of survival for the origins of civilization. The most dangerous assumption in history is not that we know too little about the past, but that what we know is complete. The 10,000-year gap exists because completeness is comforting. It allows us to believe that civilization began when it became visible, that progress follows a clean upward path, and that collapse is an exception rather than a rule. But when the gap is examined honestly, it reveals something far more unsettling. That human history is not defined by beginnings, but by recoveries. What we call the birth of civilization is not a spark, it is an echo. The earliest cities did not emerge from ignorance, they emerged from caution. They were built by people who remembered instability without remembering its cause. They encoded fear into stone, ritual, and law. They organized society not to discover the world, but to prevent it from ending again. This is why early civilizations appear obsessed with cycles. Time was not seen as a straight line, but as repetition. Ages rise and fall. Worlds are born and destroyed. Order replaces chaos, only to yield to it again. This worldview was not philosophical abstraction. It was lived experience passed down until the details faded but the structure remained. The gap represents the moment when detail was lost. Not all at once, not everywhere, but enough to sever continuity. Knowledge that depends on uninterrupted transmission cannot survive fragmentation. Navigation routes die when coastlines vanish. Trade collapses when ports disappear. Expertise evaporates when specialization becomes unsustainable. What survives is what can be practiced locally, remembered orally, and embedded into daily life. Everything else becomes sacred, symbolic, or forbidden. Over generations, the memory of a connected world shrinks into stories of gods, giants, or ancestors who lived before. Geography becomes myth. History becomes ritual, and when writing finally reappears, it captures the fragments without their original context. From that moment on, the past becomes distorted. We mistake survival for invention. We mistake restoration for progress. We mistake recovery for origin. The 10,000-year gap is not an absence of intelligence, creativity, or ambition. It is the shadow cast by a collapse so large that it erased its own infrastructure. A collapse that left humanity alive but disconnected. This is why civilization appears to restart almost simultaneously in multiple regions. Not because the same idea was invented again and again, but because the same pressure lifted everywhere at once. Sea levels stabilized, climate calmed, populations grew, isolation eased, the world became navigable again, and humanity did what it has always done when conditions allow. It connected, but this time the connection survived long enough to be recorded. That survival changed everything. Recorded history creates the illusion of permanence. It tricks us into believing that what is written cannot be lost. But writing is not memory. It is storage, and storage depends on systems. When systems fail, writing becomes as fragile as speech. The people who come after do not inherit explanations. They inherit fragments. They inherit roads without maps, tools without manuals, structures without stories. They reconstruct meaning from what remains, and they do exactly what we have done. They assume they are the beginning. The real lesson of the 10,000-year gap is not about the past. It is about us. We are not immune to forgetting. We are not immune to collapse. We are not immune to fragmentation. Our confidence is built on continuity, and continuity is never guaranteed. The same forces that erase the previous world are active again. Rising seas, climate instability, coastal dependence, global interconnection without global resilience. We tell ourselves that technology makes us different. History suggests that technology makes us faster, not safer. If our civilization were to fracture, future archaeologists would not find our internet. They would not find our databases. They would not find our explanations. They would find concrete, plastic, metal, and confusion. They would debate our sudden competence. They would argue about our origins. They would create myths to explain what they could not understand. And somewhere in their timeline, there would be a gap, a long silence, a missing chapter. They would call it mysterious. They would call it empty. They would be wrong. The 10,000-year gap is not a mystery waiting to be solved. It is a pattern waiting to be recognized. Human history does not move forward once. It moves forward, breaks, and begins again. The question is not whether there was a civilization before the gap. The question is whether we are willing to accept that we are not the first, and may not be the last, to forget what we once knew. Because the gap is not behind us. It is always forming, and whether it becomes another missing chapter depends on one thing alone: whether we choose to remember or assume that this time history will be different.